Hey guys, I'm Patrick Hall with Fstoppers.com, and today I have the 15 to 30 2.8 wide angle lens from Tamron. I'm gonna hike into this swamp and do my first attempt at astrophotography. So this is a location I've been wanting to come out for a long time. This is off of Highway 17 here in South Carolina, and it has all these really cool trees that are dead, and they've just been out here in this pluff mud. So I've hiked out here into the swamp. There's mud everywhere. There's all kind of marshlands, and I brought the moon boots, so you guys will appreciate that. This has actually been really nice to get out in this location. And basically, I'm gonna take some of the techniques that I learned from Elia's astrophotography section in his Photographing the World tutorial that we did with him, along with some of Mike Kelly's frame blending. He does a lot of light painting, and I actually might do that as it gets darker. But basically, I want to run over the camera setup that I have here for you guys. This is the Nikon D750, and on here I have the 15 to 30 2.8 wide angle lens by Tamron. I really love this lens because it has VC, so I can shoot a lot of handheld video with it, but it's also a super wide angle lens with a fast aperture, which is perfect for stars. Let me tell you about how I'm going to approach this shot first. I actually have two cameras. This camera here is pointing towards the setting sun, and I have another camera over there that's actually pointing towards the highway. And you can't see this very easily right now, but we have these really cool clouds on the horizon, and I'm gonna get some car streaks going through the frame over there. So I'm basically going to take a bunch of pictures and see which composition I like when I get back to the studio. So before the sun completely sets, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get a base exposure for kind of this blue hour. I'm trying to get as much detail out of the foreground and out of these trees that are in front of me before it gets pitch black. So what I've done is I've focused here on the trees. I have everything kind of stopped down. I'm shooting at f8, ISO 100, and right now I'm shooting at 1 second long. So let's take this picture. And as you can see here, this picture does not look nice at all. The sky looks really bad. You have a lot of blue and red in the sky. The foreground is extremely blue, but I do have detail, and I have detail at a really low ISO. So I'm gonna have a nice clean foreground that I can then blend into my exposures later, and I can tweak the white balance in post to get this as warm as I want. This isn't really that important of a photograph. This is just going to give me the detail in the foreground that I can blend later with the stars. Another little trick that I have here is I've set my camera to a self-timer of 5 seconds, so that it allows me to take a picture, let the camera sit for a while, and then it's going to count down 5 seconds and take my exposure. This helps mitigate any kind of shake that I have in the camera. Ideally, I would have some kind of remote, but I don't shoot a lot of this stuff. So again, this is my first attempt at this, and I know I just have to get the sharpest image without moving the camera. Now, one little trick that I've learned from Elia is that you don't want to change your focus when you do this sort of thing. So I'm focused on the trees. They're the closest element to my camera, and I'm not going to refocus. I want the stars to actually be a little out of focus, and this may seem a little strange, but when we start blending the different frames together, you're going to see that if I had refocused on the stars, I would get the trees out of focus, which would actually make it very hard to line up. And to make sure that my focus doesn't change or that my lens doesn't change the millimeter it's shooting at, I've actually taped my camera's lens with a piece of gaffer's tape. So while I'm shooting this video, I'm also running over to my other camera and I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm taking multiple exposures shooting this way. I've calculated that that camera is going to have some of the Milky Way galaxy in it. It is the winter time here in Charleston, so it's not in the perfect position, but it still is gonna offer a really cool star shot this way with the Milky Way. And this camera here is facing the opposite side, and my thought is, if the car trails from the traffic become a problem for that camera, at least I'll have a second angle that might work. So basically, I have my base exposures from the ambient light. It's starting to get really dark out here that I don't think that there's any more base level exposures that I need. So it's kind of just a waiting game. I'm gonna wait 30 minutes to an hour, wait for the sun to completely set, and hope that the stars are nice and bright. We've tried to time this with perfect weather. So basically the sky is pretty much cloudless, especially in the direction this camera's shooting. But back towards Charleston, we do have kind of a front with some clouds. So that shot might actually not turn out that well, but I really won't know until the stars come out and we start doing long exposures. Basically, you want to come out here when there's no weather, there's no clouds in the sky, so that the stars are as bright and sharp as possible. So let's wait for the sun to completely go down. I can't see any stars at the moment, but I think in about an hour, this is gonna look amazing out here. So as you can see, it is pitch black out here now. We've waited an hour and a half. We actually left and got Waffle House. We let all of our cameras run so we could capture time lapses kind of the light change. And if you look at these time lapses, you can see that the sky is just really, really bright. We do have some light pollution on the far horizon, and that's happening on both sides. And of course, from this camera angle, we also have the car traffic, which I'm going to try to mitigate by getting a few frames with no traffic whatsoever. One really helpful tip that Elias shared with me when I was on the road with him filming his tutorial is an app called Skyview. And this thing is so cool. You download it on your phone and it will track where you are so that you can point your phone up to the sky and you can track different constellations, different galaxies, different planets. And so for this shot, I kind of just faced the camera up into the sky. But my second camera over here, I faced Andromeda, and that's gonna allow me to get the entire Milky Way galaxy in the photograph, even though it's kind of out of season for that constellation and galaxy to show up in the middle of the sky. But I definitely highly recommend this app. It's super useful, and it's just cool to be able to move it around and track stars. I know nothing about constellations and stars, so this is a really helpful little tip that you can use in your own photography. Now in this situation, I've chose to go at ISO 1600. I've changed my camera to f2.8 now, and I'm doing exposures between 15 seconds and 30 seconds. And the images look really good on the back of my camera. I think I can bump the contrast up a little bit later when I get back to the computer, but my fear is I don't want to go too high. You could go up to 3200, but at some point you're going to just start to get a lot of noise, and I want as much detail as possible from the sky. The biggest challenge that I have out here is when I start doing 20-second exposures, I keep getting cars driving by and they're casting light onto all of these trees. So I keep taking multiple exposures, trying to get that perfect 20-second period where there's no cars out here, but I'm also grabbing some images that do have some light spill, and it's kind of an interesting effect. Since I'm not really sure the direction I'm gonna go with the post-processing with either of these images, I'm going to also have my assistant David do a little bit of light painting around this area so that when I get back to Photoshop, if I need any extra ambient exposures or any lights hitting the edges of these trees, I'll have those frames to blend in if I need them. For my light source, I brought a ProPhoto B1 light out here, and I used a pretty moderately sized 7-foot octabox, which is a little bit ridiculous to be honest, but it allows for really soft light. I'm using that octabox right now so that you can see the trees behind me. Otherwise, this shot would be completely black. But I just had David kind of walk around, and I did a mix of ambient exposures with the modeling lamp, and then I'm also using my ProPhoto remote here to trigger off a couple flash pops. For this light painting, I'm just kind of having David light from really hard angles, so 90 degrees from the camera, maybe from behind the tree to give a little highlight. I'm not sure that I'll need these images, but I think they could be really useful if I get back in post and a tree's a little dark, or I find that one of the car light shots looks really cool. I might want to blend in a little bit of the light painting to kind of even that out. So that's about it. I've taken some really low ISO shots at f8 early in the day as my base blue layer exposure, and then hours later I've changed everything to 2.8 and made a very long exposure to capture the stars. And my hope is that I can go back into Photoshop, blend the two exposures together, maybe even use 4, 5, 6 frames and create something that really looks cool. Looking at the back of both of these cameras, I can tell that this camera facing away from the highway doesn't look that dramatic, but the camera that's facing towards the highway has the problem of all the car trails, but it has these really dramatic clouds that are sitting right on the horizon, and because they're being lit by a city really far away, I think that's gonna be the better looking image. So let me take all of these photos into Photoshop, figure out which image I wanna work on, and I'm gonna try to composite my very first astro photo into something really cool. All right guys, so here we are in the post-production studio. I'm gonna go through my Photoshop file and show you how I've used several exposures to make this final photograph and hopefully give you guys some tips that you can do to improve your own landscape and astrophotography. One thing that I find really important before editing is you really want to have a good shave. So I've made sure that I've shaved off all of my beard. I find that I just do a little bit better post-production when I can clearly see and I don't have any kind of irritating hair on my face. So just wanted to let you guys know that ahead of time. But basically, let's just open up this file here. And you can see I have a couple groups, a couple folders here, and I don't know, probably like 8 or 10 different layers. So let's go through each one of these layers and I'll show you the thought process behind coming up with the final image and some of the simple retouching that I did to create this final photograph. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off all of these layers here. And you can see this is the base layer. This is probably like 70% of the total photograph is based on this one single image. And just so that you can see what this image looked like straight out of camera, I'm going to open up Lightroom here, and I'll quickly just show you some of the images leading up to this. As you can see here, I'm pretty much trying to come up with a good composition using this tree. I found this tree to be the most interesting tree of all of them out there. And one little tip that you can do when you're trying to set up a composition late at night that I learned from Alaya is you can use your iPhone and turn on the flashlight feature and have it fire onto something in the foreground. This is going to make it really bright and very easy to autofocus on so that you know everything in your picture is nice and sharp and you don't have your foreground out of focus and your background in focus. So you always want the things closest to your camera to be nice and sharp, and using a light or a phone makes that really, really easy. So that's what I'm doing in these couple of photographs. I'm just figuring out the composition and using my flashlight there to make sure that the tree is nice and focused. As you can see at this point of the night, it's still too bright outside for the stars to really register, but it's perfect for getting kind of a base exposure. Here's a frame that I took that's very heavy in ambient light that I could use for blending in later if I needed to. I don't think I really used this frame, but I did take it in case I wanted to have a shot with light on all of the trees. So let me move ahead to the final image that I used for my basic raw file, and it is this file right here. And so this file is the exact same as this. And the way that I got this was basically I just tweaked some of the white balance, I pulled some of the highlights down, I exposed for the shadows a little bit more. I just did some really basic tweaks in Lightroom to get this file. But this is what I call the base layer, and this is a very warm white balance. You can see I'm at about 5800. And the reason that I chose a warm white balance is because while I was out there shooting this photograph, I had these really interesting clouds on the low horizon. And back behind the horizon, I had a lot of light pollution from a nearby town. Although it's kind of hard to see exactly what my eyes saw when I was out there, basically I had a nice dark blue sky with the stars, and then on the horizon I had this really warm light with cloud coverage. So my thought was, in looking at this photograph here, was that wouldn't it be really cool to keep the stars all blue like they appeared to my naked eye, but also show the light pollution in the clouds and use that to my advantage to produce kind of a really interesting color scheme. I will say that when I went out to do this photograph, my hope was that I had no clouds and the sky would be nice and blue and it'd be really dramatic, but I kind of got lucky in this case because I think that having some stars in the sky while also having some cloud coverage here at the bottom actually made this photograph way more interesting. So now that you've seen the base image that I've used for this photograph, one problem that I really see in the foreground is that it's just really too dark. I had a lot of traffic driving by, casting additional light on the scene, but none of that traffic was able to hit the foreground, which was, I don't know, 100 yards away. So to me, this just looks really dark. So I want to brighten this up, but instead of just pulling out detail in the raw file, which will be kind of muddy and dark and boring, I decided to use another frame that I took where I actually used my strobe to brighten up the foreground. So here's a few frames that I'm going to show later on as well, but these frames here are just exposed for only my strobe. So you can see I'm using a huge octabox, I'm throwing in a lot of light from the far right of the frame, and because I'm using a 7-foot octabox, I'm actually able to get fairly soft light. It's kind of hard on this tree because it has a lot of texture, but here on the ground, it's actually kind of subdued. It's just a very natural overcast looking exposure, which really helps when you're trying to blend something into your frame without it really standing out too much. Some of these other frames here are even softer. I had the light even closer. It's literally just outside of the frame here. And I can't remember exactly what frame I used, but if I open up this image and turn on this next layer, basically I blended in one of these strobe shots into my foreground, and then I just, I kept the white balance really warm. So in this picture, if I came back here and bumped up the white balance, you can see I can get a really warm white balance that matches the original exposure. So that's all that this second image is doing, is it's just brightening up the tree. You can actually see I have a little bit of light hitting the tree that's not there. And again, if I just exposed and lifted the shadows up in this image, I wouldn't have this nice highlight here. So I like the blending technique of using the strobe. So the real heavy lifting in this image is going to be done by this next layer. And essentially what this next layer is, as I turn it on, it's basically the exact same image. It's the same raw file as my background, but I've changed the white balance so that I can get the nice blue stars. So if I come back here to the original image, here's the photograph with a white balance of 5800. If I just bring this down here, I don't know what I actually used, but maybe 3000, and then I remove some of the magenta and bring some of the green back in, and maybe I change the exposure a little bit and maybe crush the blacks. Somewhere around here, I'm able to get an image where my stars are nice and blue, and I feel like the horizon's a little green, it's a little muddy. I don't really like the color here, but I love the color in the sky. So I exported this raw file out a second time, and then I stacked it on top of my base image, and then I added a mask, which, let me see if I can turn this on. You can see my mask layer here. I've kind of dodged some of the trees, and then I've hand painted out the clouds. And this is the one part that kind of takes an artistic interpretation. I believe I just used my Wacom and I just kind of painted this in really subtly. I changed the flow up here so that it was very subtle and soft. And then you also want to make sure that your brush is not hard but soft. And this will allow you to paint back in the warm colors from below in a way that looks very natural. So these clouds are not only getting thinner, but they're also going to have less color intensity. And so I wanted to mask that in a very natural looking way. For me, this is more or less what the image actually looked like when I was out on location. This is how my eyes saw it, but my camera can't quite capture the two different white balances very well. So I'm going to turn on this layer again, and basically with these three images, this is my base layer that I'm going to work on. So looking at this, one thing I really wanted to do is create a little more contrast in the sky. And just a little tip for you guys, a lot of times when I edit images, I actually look at my navigator up here, and I look at this small thumbnail. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to envision what this image might look like on social media, what it might look like on the Fstoppers community or 500 pics or Facebook. And I always want this thumbnail to have a lot of pop to it. So while it's nice to look at this large high-res image and zoom in, I still also sometimes look at the small image to see if this image stands out alone on its own. And one thing I really think I need to do to this photograph is make the stars pop a little more. So this next layer is just a curves layer that I've added, and if I open the curves, you can see I've just kind of added a boost in the mids. I've crushed the blacks very, very slightly, and I've actually left the highlights exactly the same here on the upper level. So my stars aren't going to get any more white or blown out, but the mid-tones are going to get a little brighter, while some of the dark tones are going to get a little darker. So if I turn this on, you can see what it does there. It just gives a little more contrast and pump into the sky. And if you look at this thumbnail, it just kind of makes it look a little more dramatic, so you definitely tell that it's a nighttime shot. If you want to do this, all you have to do is go up to Layers, New Adjustment Layer, and then go to Curves. And if you click this little button here, Use Previous Layer to create Clipping Mask, and you turn that on and hit OK, it will give you an adjustable curves layer that you can change any time in this process. It's non-destructive, and it will apply it only to the layer below. So it's only applying it to my blue star layer. If I turn this on and off, you can see nothing down here in the foreground changes in terms of contrast. my contrast is only changing on this, this white balance layer here. So that's really cool. Now that I have the image pretty much balanced, this would be about 90% of the photo, I have to step back and look at this image and say, what is happening in the overall photograph that I don't like? And one thing that I don't like that is actually very natural is I don't like how dark the tops of these trees are. These branches are very, very black, yet some of these branches over here have a nice highlight to them. You can see that over here too with these trees in the background. And what that is I had huge semi-trucks and cars and a lot of traffic traveling behind my scene, and they would cast warm light into my scene, but that light was only hitting some of these trees in very specific places. As you can see, these branches up here are positioned in just a way that no ambient light from the traffic ever hit them. And so while that is the natural light, and nothing in this photograph at this point really has been faked or altered, to me it looks very unrealistic. It just looks weird that these branches are dark. I would probably prefer it if this photograph had completely silhouetted trees, or if they're going to be lit, I want all of the branches to be lit throughout the entire scene. So this is where the strobe light really came in handy. As I showed you in the shooting section of this video, I had David walk around with a huge ProPhoto light, and I had him selectively light specific parts of the scene. And it's hard to tell from this photograph, but this light is huge, and it's like 10 or 15 feet up in the air. So it's really high, it's kind of cumbersome. I will admit it's very difficult to shoot with a huge octabox out on location when you're doing landscape photography. It's not really a traditional thing most people would do. But what it allowed me to do was light huge areas. I mean, you can see in this photograph, the light is probably 50 feet away from these trees. And it allows the light to actually be fairly soft. If this was just a tiny speed light, I would have much harsher light everywhere as opposed to this softer light. So basically what I did was I took a few of these strobe lit frames where I changed my exposure to 1.6 seconds so that the image would be very black. Because I'm shooting at like 2 seconds, I was actually able to manually pop the flash. So sometimes in 1 or 2 seconds I would fire the flash twice to give me even more light if I needed it. But basically I just took these frames and I just added them to wherever I thought I needed light on the trees. So I'm going to turn on this folder called trees, and you can see I have about 6 images in here. And I'm going to turn this on, and you can see what this is going to do. This is going to add highlights all over my trees. It makes everything really pop out. You can see the difference here where I have no light on the upper part of the trees, and now I have a lot of highlights. So this is really designed to replicate the light that I'm getting from the traffic, except I'm making that light appear as if it's on every part of these branches, even though they clearly did not have any light hitting them. So I'm not really trying to make this shot a heavy light painted photograph. I'm simply trying to mimic the light painting I'm already getting from the cars, the natural light painting. I'm just trying to add a little bit of extra light where I feel like I need it to make this image stand out even more. So this is a technique that I learned from Mike Kelly, who's an architectural photographer, and basically the way he approaches his photography is he has a camera on a tripod, just like we're doing here, but he uses flash in very interesting ways, and then he paints that flash in to make the image look the way your eyes would see it. It gives so much more detail, so much more clarity, and it's a really, really cool effect. This isn't to be confused with HDR photography. That's not what we're doing at all. In fact, I'm going to turn off all of these layers and show you just how powerful this is. If I turn on this frame, this is just adding a little bit of highlight on the right side, and you can see how clean that is. If I was to bump up this raw file, I have no detail at all in these shadows. I would never be able to get a highlight like that just from the raw file, no matter how much I dodged or burned the image. There's just not the same shadow clarity, there's not the same light angle, it just doesn't exist there. So with this one frame, I'm able to add this highlight on here on the side of the tree. And then what's really cool is with a second frame, I actually have David lighting from even further behind the tree. And with this frame, I'm able to add really a second highlight that's even more refined. It's a little brighter, it's a little more behind the tree, and you can see how beautiful the detail is here. I have one highlight from the strobe, and then I have a second, even brighter highlight from further behind. So basically by turning on all of these frames, I'm able to get this really cool detail in these trees way back here. I mean, you can see this tree. It just has some really nice subtle highlight that just wouldn't be there from the dark raw file. So this is a very powerful tool that I learned from Mike Kelly that I use in a lot of commercial photography. He uses it in interiors and architectural photography. Here I'm using it on a landscape photograph, which is probably pretty uncommon. I will note that Elia Liccardi does this a lot too, but he does it with natural light. So he would just wait until the highlights naturally happened on the tree, and then he would blend what he calls moments in time. It's essentially the same thing that Mike does, but instead of bringing fake strobe light onto your scene, Elia blends in the natural light where he wants it. So if he wanted more light in the foreground, he would have probably had a frame that was taken earlier in the day, and then he can just paint it back in, and it's essentially doing the same sort of effect, but with natural light instead of strobe light. So this is a really cool technique that you can do that will give your images much more dynamic range without trying to have to fake it by pulling out muddy colors in your shadows. One other little thing that I did here, if I turn on this layer, you can see that I actually have a file called log. And what this is I just kind of felt like this side of the frame, the bottom left in the foreground, was a little boring. So I actually moved this log, this tree, over and photographed it a few times, knowing that I could easily paint this log back in and create something that was a little more interesting in the foreground. So this is a really cool tip if you need to move something in your photograph or you want to add something that's not naturally there. If you know that you're going to composite the photo ahead of time, you can move things around in your foreground and really utilize the items there on location to give you a better photograph. In fact, this entire branch right here was not originally in this photo at all, and I'm going to show you guys here in the raw files. As you can see, here's one of the strobe shots that I used for the trees. I do not have this cool branch in this photo at all. What I actually did was I realized after taking these images that my foreground was kind of boring. With an image like this, I can't really tell that my foreground is boring because it's already nighttime and I'm having a hard time seeing what's in front of me. But once I lit up the scene, I could tell that this was just kind of boring right here. So what I did was I found a heavy branch off to the side and I dragged it into my frame. And once I had it in the frame, I lit it and positioned it exactly like I wanted so that I could get this shot here. And as you can see in this frame here, I dragged the log over to produce another leading line. And then in Photoshop, I just combined the two images so I could have this image and I painted in this log so that it just looked a little more interesting. If I had time, I probably would have put the log even in more places all the way up, leading straight to the bottom of the frame, and I think it would have looked even cooler. But this is, again, a very untraditional technique that you may not think to do on location, but luckily I saw it, I moved the log, and I made something I think more interesting than a shot without anything in the foreground. So now that I have, I would say, 90% of the image done, there's a few creative decisions that I need to make. And one of the biggest creative decisions I have to make is, do I like these car trails in the background? It was near impossible to take a 20-second exposure and not get some kind of traffic going through my scene. I did capture a few frames with no traffic at all, but with no traffic I also lose all of the highlights on the trees. So it was kind of difficult to get the perfect photograph out on location. What I like about this image, now that I'm at this point, is this almost feels like kind of an Armageddon type photograph to me. It's got this cool blue sky above that kind of gives you, a view of the universe. But then on the foreground, it's very warm and it almost looks like fire. All these trees are dead. It just gives you this really eerie, kind of interesting feeling that maybe something's not right with this scene. Maybe the earth is, in shambles and there's no more life. It just, I don't know, has this apocalyptic feel. But with the car trails, I don't know, it kind of brings in a technological, modern feel to it, but I kind of feel like it takes away from the frame. It almost makes it seem like there is life here, even though the overall photograph looks very dead and desolate. So what I did with this folder here called Cars is I took a few of the images that I had where I didn't have any car trails, and I blended them in. And as you can see here, I've pretty much gotten rid of all of the car trails. And I think as a whole, I like this direction even better. I'm gonna zoom in here so that you guys can see that I wasn't able to get rid of every single car. And if you look, there's still a faint glow of lights back here. So it's not perfect, but for right now, it's leading me in the right direction. So now that I've removed most of the cars, another thing that definitely needs to get removed is this airplane. Because this photograph was taken over 20 seconds, and the frame that I liked the best in terms of the clouds and the lighting, it had this plane that flew through my scene here. So all I did was I duplicated this layer and I cloned out the airplane. You can see that here. If I turn off all these layers, I've just copied more of the sky, and then I took the clone tool and just removed that little streak so I could get rid of the airplane. So at this point, I think this is pretty close to being done. I'm going to zoom in and show you a few things that I did on this final layer that I call final clones. And basically, I have another airplane right here that I have to get rid of. I have a water tower and some kind of red light back here I got to get rid of. I have my car. It's back here in the frame. And of course, I have, you know, some traffic that I still didn't really get out from the previous photo. So here's one more image where I just hit Alt-Control-Shift-E, and what that does is it stamps everything below into one single photograph. And then that photograph, I use the clone stamp to remove some signs here, some traffic signs. I removed the rest of the traffic. I removed my car, and I removed this streak of light here. So you can see this really cleans up the background really nicely, and it gives me that nice desolate horizon where you wouldn't even necessarily know that there's a highway there with cars. So I think I'm pretty much done at this point. The one last thing I really want to do is just add a little more contrast to the entire scene. Now that I feel like my sky has the contrast that I like and the foreground has the contrast that I like, I want to do a little global contrast on everything now that they've all been layered on top of each other. So I added one more curves layer here, and you can see what this is doing. The blacks really aren't being affected at all, and the upper highlights aren't being affected at all. But kind of the upper mid-ranges, I wanted to give those just a little bit of a boost. So if I turn this on, you can see it just lifts the image just ever so slightly. It gives a little more brightness here on the horizon, which I think is ultimately the biggest interest of the entire photograph. It's this tree and this horizon. So that's pretty much it. You can zoom in here and you can see the stars are nice and sharp. That Tamron lens is absolutely incredible for this type of photography. It's really sharp. I would argue that it rivals anything made by Nikon or Canon, and it's really a necessity. If you want to shoot nighttime astrophotography, you really need a fast lens that's really wide so you can get long exposures without your stars starting to blur. And you can see these stars here are nice and sharp. So I think the Tamron lens worked really well. The light painting was excellent. I didn't really expect to use that, but I brought it out just in case. And I think I came out with an interesting image. This is the first star photograph I've ever tried to shoot. This isn't really something that I'm known for. This isn't a genre of photography that I really go out and try to create images within. But now that I have this photograph, I couldn't be more pleased with it. This location's awesome. The sky turned out great. The cloud coverage and the backlight with the light pollution was really cool. I am just really thrilled with this. I'm going to try to print this huge and put it somewhere in my house. I think this has been a huge success, especially since it's the first attempt I've ever done. So I hope that really helps you guys out. Obviously, I didn't have time to go through all of the masks and show you exactly how I did that. But if you want to learn more about how to do the light painting and blending exposures together in a really simple and seamless fashion, I would highly recommend checking out Mike Kelly's architectural photography tutorial that we did with him. The tips he shows in there have really blown my mind, and I use them so much now in my wedding photography and my commercial photography. It's really changed the way that I approach creating a photograph. It's the compositing techniques that he uses is just absolutely essential if you're going to be a photographer who uses multiple exposures and wants to blend them. If you want to learn more about really complex masking, including luminosity masking, definitely check out Elia's landscape tutorial. I have so much still to learn from that tutorial that when I look at my masking techniques, they're definitely very sloppy compared to what Elia does. But he is a true master at blending all of this together from a landscape point of view. And in his second cityscape tutorial, he actually teaches you how to shoot stars, which is where I got most of the information that I had for this photograph. So definitely check those out. If you enjoy this video tutorial, definitely subscribe to the Fstoppers YouTube channel below, because we release videos like this every single week. And if you prefer reading articles on photography, head over to fstoppers.com, where we have a group of about 30 professional photographers who write articles every single day on all sorts of genres of photography.